Networking Part 2. In this nugget, we're continuing our discussion of networking with Networking Part 2. We'll start off by just discussing how to configure the network. We'll look in the properties of our network adapter and see some of the common settings that you'll need to know how to configure. We'll also take a brief discussion of IPv6 because it is on the horizon, it is coming. It's not a big issue with the 70-622 exam or any of the current Vista exams, but you should have at least an overall idea of how it works. We'll also take a look here at DHCP and some troubleshooting issues specifically related to whether or not you can get an IP address and configuration from a DHCP server. And then, kind of at the end of my DHCP discussion, I just will have a few miscellaneous things that don't really fit into any other topic, but I just kind of crammed them into the bottom of the slide to make sure that I don't leave anything out for you. And then I go into a bigger topic of wireless networking, and so we need to be able to securely configure our wireless clients and networks. And then we finally conclude with remote access, which does not mean, probably, what you think it means. Alright, one of the first things I want to do as we get started here is to kind of cover, first things first. And perhaps I should have done this in the last video, but I want to make sure that we have a common understanding for the proper configuration of your IP addresses. And normally, this is going to still involve IP version 4. IP version 6 is coming in some point in the future. I mean, it kind of has to. But even though Windows Vista supports IPv6, most networks that we'll be addressing, and I think also most of the exam issues that we'll relate to are going to be IP version 4. Now, how do we configure our network connections? Well, we'll go up here to the left within Network and Sharing Center and choose Manage Network Connections. And then once we're in here, we right-click on our existing network connection and we choose Properties. Okay? And then after User Account Control, this is where all of this will then be configured. Let me just identify what some of these things are. I don't think you're going to need to know about all of them for the exam. Some are more important than others, but it helps to know what they are. The client from Microsoft Networks, this simply allows us to be able to access resources that are being shared elsewhere. So if on the file server across my network somewhere else, if there's a resource that I can access, I have to have the client from Microsoft Networks in order to be able to access that resource. This is there by default. All these things, in fact, are there by default. I haven't added or subtracted anything from this list. There's also the quality of service packet schedule. This is useful for traffic control, especially for things like streaming video or perhaps any other kind of media that takes place over the network, where it would be strange if it got choppy or blocked up somehow or something like that. Whereas other kinds of ordinary data, it can have kind of an ebb and flow in the data as long as the file gets transferred eventually, or the email gets delivered eventually, or whatever else it is. The quality of services for those kinds of things, especially, like I said, for streaming media, that type of thing. And then finally, printer sharing for Microsoft Networks is what I have to have selected if I do have a resource that I'm sharing on this computer. Okay, and if I don't have this installed, or if I've got this deselected and I'm trying to share something, then it will not be made available over the network. Okay. And then IP version 6 is a default item nowadays as well. We'll be looking a little bit more at that as we go. And then IP version 4, I'm going to come back to that one in just a moment because that's where most of our configuration will take place in here. Then there's the link layered topology discover mapper IO driver. This is going to be what maps the network and allows us to access other PCs and network devices and so forth. And this is the one that is going to allow this PC, actually it says it down here, doesn't it? Allows this PC to be discovered and located on the network. Okay, so that's what that's about. But let's go back up here to TCP/IP version 4 so that we can see how this should properly be configured. So what we're looking at right now is what we call a static configuration. This means that someone has gone in here and manually configured all of the IP addressing information and the DNS information and so forth, rather than choosing to obtain an IP address automatically and or a DNS server address automatically. Okay, so this is all a manual process the way this looks right now. This is okay on a few different computers, or a little small branch office with 10 or 12 computers in it, perhaps. But in most enterprises, this is highly impractical because you can't just have a help desk person or an administrator go to each desktop if there are thousands of desktops and do all of this, keep it all straight, make sure that you don't accidentally assign the same IP address to 2 or more computers, or that you don't have any other human errors in here, that you, instead of typing 255 here, for example, you might have accidentally hit the 4 or something, and then now you've got another problem here. So that's the kind of thing that we want to keep away from, is all this manual configuration when when we can. The exception to this will normally be things like IP printers, which you want to have on a consistent static IP address so that you always know what the IP address is, or at least the IT staff does. And then also things like servers. We don't normally give them DHCP assigned IP addresses because, once again, we want to keep them at a consistent IP address at all times. Whereas if you have DHCP, then periodically the IP address of any client computer that receives a DHCP address could change from time to time. Okay. Now, if I want to again use DHCP, I'll just choose the top option here, obtain an IP address automatically, and then you'll see this option selected with this option, but you could choose a different IP address for the DNS servers if you wanted to. Okay. All right. Now let's go ahead and also take a look at here it is. Now, if I obtain an IP address automatically, I'll just go back up to this. Then notice that there's a new tab that appears that says alternate configuration. Normally what happens is, if I'm choosing to automatically receive an IP address and the DHCP server is unavailable for some reason, this could happen for a number of reasons. Number one, I might have a router between me and the DHCP server, and that router is either blocking DHCP packets, or it's misconfigured, or it's down and it's not available to provide service. Well, in that case, I wouldn't be able to reach the DHCP server. So if that's the case, then I'm going to get an automatic private IP address instead by default. PIPA addresses always start with 169.254, and I have that on a whiteboard here in a little while for you to see. Then also, if I don't want to use a PIPA, then I could choose to use a user configured address instead. Now, the original idea for this was such that if I take my laptop from the corporation, where it normally gets an IP address from a DHCP server, and then I take it home and connect to my cable modem or whatever, then the idea there was that early in the internet days, you might have had to assign a static IP address for your ISP in order to gain access to the internet, like at home, for example. Well, then you would enter in all the IP configuration in here that your ISP gave you so that you would be able to access the internet. Well, nowadays that's not usually too much of an issue anymore. We can just usually leave this here if we want to, because most ISPs will now also use DHCP to deliver an IP configuration to you as the internet client. Now that I've mentioned IPv6 a few different times here, let's go ahead and address this in a little bit more detail. Now, IPv6 is a gigantic addressing space. It's really beyond, in my opinion, human comprehension. Nobody's brain is big enough to grasp the number that you have with IPv6, because you can get such a large range out of it. We've had the problem in IP version 4 of running out of IP addresses, especially in Asia and some other countries, and where they were unfairly allocated as well to certain organizations. A lot of universities have way more addresses than they'll ever need, but they haven't given them up to other people either, not all of them anyway. So here with IPv6, we have such a big number, we even actually have websites that tell us how to say what the number is, and you can make note of the address up there if you want to, or you can Google on this if you want. But here's the number. Look at that, down there at the bottom. Whatever that is, it's just gigantic. It's just an astronomical figure, and here's how you'd say the number, and it tells you how big that is down here, 340 undecillion, 282 decillion, and so on. So you see how big that number is. And then I even give you some examples down here of, this. Every atom in the human body could have an IPv6 address. I didn't see that actually earlier when I looked at this. So that's that's unbelievable. My friend Jeremy Chowra, who teaches a lot of Cisco courses for us here at CBT Nuggets, I heard him say this, because he also looked up something about this number. If there's about 130 million people born every year on this planet, and if each person lived to 72 years, and there were 130 million people born every year for the next 5 billion years until the sun burns out, then each one of those people would have 53 times the amount of IPv4 addresses available, and of course there's about 4 billion IP version 4 addresses available out there, or that exist, and we would have about 53 times 4 billion addresses for each second of our lives. So that is a gigantic number. It's just unbelievable. And, humans can't even comprehend numbers. Whoops, I don't know what I clicked on there, but humans can't really even comprehend numbers that big. The only time you'll ever see a number that big is if you have a peek into Bill Gates' checking account. So anyway, it's just a gigantic addressing space. Now, for the addressing, you can use DHCP, or you can use an automatic configuration. And of course, this sounds cool because it, after all, automatic and it's even less work for me than DHCP is. And this actually kind of works. You see, what happens here is if I've got a router right here, and I'm not very good at drawing router diagrams, but there's a router, and it sends out a beacon. If it's an IPv6 compatible router, it'll send out a beacon advertising what its subnet ID is. Okay. And then what happens is the clients that are out here, like here's a desktop computer, for example, it will hear what that subnet ID is, and then it will concatenate that with other unique information about itself, such as its MAC address and so forth. And the subnet is going to be the first 64 bits of this address, and then the client will enter in its own MAC address and some other identifying information in the second 64 bits. And because of this subnet ID that's included now in the IPv6 address, it can keep track of what messages are destined for its own network or other networks, and that way it knows what to send through the router and what not to send through the router. So it's like almost too easy. It's kind of like, we have a sense that because it's such a huge addressing space that the IP addressing itself must be equally complicated. Well, that's not necessarily true. Actually, in a lot of ways, it's much simpler. But you can, like I said, still use DHCP if you want to. Now, there's also link local. Now we'll be looking here at, or we have looked at APIPA addresses or 169.254 addresses. And remember, with IPv4, that's what a host does if it's not able to access a DHCP server and it has to self-assign its own address. Well, in IPv6, there's a similar function there, only it's called link local. Actually, I think the name's changed to something else now, but the name has changed a couple of times. But a link local address will start off with FE80, and if I do an IP config here, then we see that this is a link local address for IPv6. It starts off with FE80 and then a colon, which is just shorthand again for zeros. Okay, so that just, these two colons mean 4 zeros for the first colon, separated by a colon, 4 zeros for the second colon. Okay, so this is the way it would actually appear in literally FE80000000, but we shorthand it by putting two colons together, and you can only use two colons together one time in a kind of a shorthanded IPv6 address. Now, if we decided to use private IP addressing, which is what this really would do by itself, then what you'll see happen here is if it's got a IPv6 compatible router, or if you see someone has configured DHCP to issue IPv6 addresses, then those addresses will all start with FEC, D, E, or F. So FEC through F is what they'll all start with. So again, for IP version 6, normally you don't need to worry about configuring the IP address because it can do it by itself. You can use DHCP if you want to, but in the 70-622 exam, most of the emphasis there will be for IP version 4. And for IP version 4, if you ever wind up with an IP address that starts like this, 169.254. Then this means that your client computer was not able to properly contact and receive an IP address configuration from a DHCP server. Once again, that could be a router in the way that is somehow misconfigured or something and it's blocking the traffic. The DHCP server service might be stopped on the server. It might have other configuration problems. It might be unplugged. It might be down for maintenance. Whatever. This just tells me that I was not able to get an address from a DHCP server. Again, this is not something that we really see in IP version 6 because in IP version 4, this is something of cause for alarm. I cannot properly get an address. This is also an unroutable address, so if I've got a multi-segmented network, then I'll only be able to communicate with other hosts that have also not been able to get an address and have also wound up with an IP address in this range. And those are the only other computers that I can communicate. Those in my network that have also experienced the same condition. But since it's not routable, I won't be able to communicate with other hosts across the network. Okay, but with IP version 6, with IP version 6 compatible networking equipment, these clients will then be able to self-assign an IP version 6 kind of a private addressing scheme, and they'll be able to communicate just fine with one another, and you won't have to really worry about it from that point. Now, if you do get an IP address like this, one of the things you might want to look at also is if the server's operating properly, there's no router issues in between that are causing a problem, for example, then check the DHCP client service. And let's go ahead and take a look at how we would do this. You do have to run this from an administrator command prompt, and I might do, I'm first going to do a net start. Maybe the service is not started properly. DHCP, and I have to put this in quotes, by the way, DHCP client, end quote. Okay, and it will now start up the DHCP client service. Now, normally that should be running anyway. In fact, if I had just restarted the computer, it would probably also have restarted it as well, because it's set to start up automatically when the computer starts up. So that's another reason why help desk folks often tell people to just restart the computer, because if it's a service-related issue that's normally supposed to start up automatically, it should do that upon restarting. Now let me show you something else here. If you want to get services stopped and started, in other words, if you want to restart a service, and that might be something else you want to do if this service is kind of acting, twitchy, it's started but it doesn't seem to be behaving properly, I could do a net stop DHCP. And by the way, for the client side of things here, I don't have to type in DHCP client. I can just do DHCP, and that's all I really need. And then I can, on the same line, type net start DHCP, and it will both stop and start that service. In other words, restarting that service. Now, I also need to talk about a few miscellaneous items. These are things that just didn't kind of make it into my other material because it didn't really just have a good spot in there, but I want to make sure that I address them before we're finished. One of those things is that you just have to know about the Connection Manager Administration Kit. For a client exam like Windows Vista, you don't have to know all of the nuances of how to configure it, all the pitfalls, all the advantages. You don't have to memorize a bunch of stuff. Just be aware of the fact that the Connection Manager Administration Kit is useful for creating connection objects for your client computers, including XP and Vista, for example, and then you can then mass distribute them to all of your clients without having to visit each computer and then doing something like this, going to network and sharing center, for example, and set up a connection or a network, and then next finish through all of this mess, because that's not really practical on a corporate level. So that's why you would use the CMAC. Now, as a quick side note, let me point something else out to you here. There's a better way of doing that, which is beyond our scope, but you could use group policy preference extensions for these types of connections instead of using the CMAC. The GPPE is a new interface that's available after Windows Vista was released, and it really comes from another company that Microsoft bought. In fact, several of my friends worked there, and they got acquired by Microsoft. And it's a company called Desktop Standard, and they created kind of add-ons to group policy, client-side extensions, and the like that would allow you to extend the ability for group policy. Well, Microsoft now calls those group policy preference extensions, and it's much easier to create these connections using the GPPE than it is the CMAC. But this is more likely to be an exam issue because this acquisition and all of that stuff came to light after the exams were already released, so I don't think you're going to see that particularly on the exam. Another thing that you might see is relating to printers. And for this, you'll just need to know that you can deploy printers as well using a group policy object. And I've got a screenshot of it right here. What you have to do is you have to get this deployed printers option that appears at the bottom of computer or user configuration. And then you can right-click on it and choose deploy printer. And then you can go through some steps to actually add printers. Now, this requires, with Windows Server 2003, R2 version of Windows Server 2003, and it also requires a schema update. Once you've done that, you then be able to do all of this here and add your printers. Now, I have to stop that for a moment and just explain the reality of this. This only works sometimes. Microsoft has had issues with this. Most people have not been able to properly get this to work, even if they've followed all of Microsoft's instructions. I have a friend of mine that sent one of the project leads at Microsoft a message about this and was kind of met with, yeah, we've kind of been having issues with that. And that's pretty much it. So this does not really actually work very well or reliably, and I wouldn't really use it in production. That's just my own opinion. Okay. A better solution, though, and this is not going to be on the exam, but it goes to my bullet right here, is that, again, group policy preference extensions are going to be better for this than the traditional method that I just showed you in the screenshot, because a GPPE will accurately and very well deploy a printer for you. And then for both of these items, I've gone to a remote desktop connection to our server here, and I've opened up a policy. This is just kind of an empty policy that I use for examples. And I might have mentioned this earlier, and when we talked about policies, then I often have an unlinked policy that I don't actually use for anything other than to kind of poke around and look at stuff. Now, this network options item is where I can create my VPN connections, for example, by right-clicking and choosing New VPN Connection. And then if I were to take this and create my VPN connection and link it to an organization operational unit with all my laptop users in it, for example, they would all automatically get this connection, and I would not have to visit each machine or use this connection manager administration kit, which also has a learning curve, by the way, and I've already got enough to learn as it is, right? So we don't want to have to learn more stuff if we don't have to, and this does the job very, very well. Then there's also our printers, and I can right-click here and choose a new printer. By the way, look at this. New TCP/IP printer. People have been screaming for that for a long time. So I can enter in an IP printer here, which is what most organizations use anyway, and we have not had that functionality in the past on Microsoft products. So that's a pretty cool thing there for using the GPPE to deploy connections and printers, and a whole bunch of other stuff there under the GPPEs, none of which is part of the exam questions, but very useful in real life. Also, let's talk here about using a VPN to get group policy object settings. And for this, let's just revisit policies for just a moment. Remember, there's something called foreground policy refreshing, which is what happens when the user logs on or when the computer starts up. Okay. There's also background refreshing, which takes place every 90 to 120 minutes. Okay. Now, if I create a new policy that says deploy XYZ software, when the clients refresh their policy in the background, because they're already started up and the user's already logged on, it will not actually deploy that software. It knows that it needs to, but it won't actually deploy it. There are a few key policy settings that do not apply in a background refresh. Okay. So this has an effect on people like my laptop users. Because if they're out of the office a lot and they connect to my network, and what happens is normally is they usually log on using cached credentials. Let's say they're at home or in a hotel, and then they say, you know what, I need to make a VPN connection back to the home office. So they'll start up their VPN connection. After some period of time, it'll download the new policy instructions to their local computer. But if one of the policies says to install a piece of software, they will never be able to do it using that method. What they'd have to be able to do is to use a VPN to actually make the connection in the first place, and then to perform their logon through the VPN directly to the server without using cached credentials. And then that would be foreground policy processing, and they would then be able to get the application installed. All right, now we're going to switch to another kind of networking. That would be wireless networking. Now, most of this is going to be administered from your wireless router using a web page. So this web page we're looking at here is embedded into the circuitry somewhere of my wireless router. And this is a pretty common one. It's just a Linksys one, which is a division of Cisco. And here we see our wireless settings. Now, we're not going to address and exhaust every single option available within one of these routers, but I am going to show you the things that are most relevant to our exam purposes and our exam objectives. First of all, take a look here at the network name, or SSID. Notice that it says Linksys. This is the default SSID, which is a service set identifier for a wireless device. And what this is going to do is it's going to broadcast, because I have SSID broadcast enabled, this name over the airwaves, and it's going to make it advertised to anybody that's looking for a wireless network connection. And that's why you see, wireless access points if you're in hotels or airports and so forth, is because they pop up and make themselves available to you. Okay. Now, one thing you could do, actually two things you could do to increase security here. Number one, change this name from Linksys, because the default password for Linksys routers and wireless access points is admin, all lowercase. And any hacker that happens to be driving by and seeing this Linksys being broadcast in your neighborhood could enter in the password admin and automatically, and then by virtue of that, be able to access your wireless router and make malicious changes. So on my production wireless access point, I've actually disabled this and named this to something else. And then the only other thing you really need to be aware of, I think, for the 70-622 is probably going to be under the wireless security item. By the way, I'm just showing you the Linksys interface. If you have D-Link or something else, or a Microsoft wireless access point, the interface, of course, is going to be different, because they've designed their web pages differently for their products, but the overall concepts are going to be the same here. Now, for this, we have a number of different ways of securing our wireless. What we want to do is to encrypt the network traffic as it's traveling, because otherwise it's free for anybody to be able to access. So if I disabled it, for example, then anybody else within range of my wireless access point could intercept all my network traffic and open up my packets or reassemble them and see a lot of things that they shouldn't be seeing. So we don't want to ever select disabled. But the other options there would be WEP, which is the Wired Equivalency Protocol, and this is probably the weakest of all these security measures. What you do with this is you simply enter in usually 128-bit encryption, and you enter in some kind of a passphrase, I like chocolate. Something like that. And then you generate some keys out of this. And then the clients that I configure need to use one of these keys in order to be able to connect to this wireless access point. Not a really good way of going, though, because there's hackers' utilities out there which are able to make quick work of these kinds of keys, and they can easily determine what the key actually is. Tools such as WebCrack and some others. So anyway, that's not so good. We also have Wi-Fi protected access, and there's a few different versions. There's this personal one, and you can use advanced encryption standard or temporal key integrity protocol. Both are good methods, and you just enter in, whatever passphrase you want, and then anybody else that makes a connection to this computer to this wireless access point will have to have the same passphrase. And I happen to be kind of a Shaquille O'Neal fan, so I decided to put his name in there. No, that's not the actual passphrase for my real network, by the way. So good luck with that. Also, you could go to WPA2 Personal. This is going to be a higher level of security. And with this one, I can, again, choose TKIP or Advanced Encryption Standard, or simply stick with Advanced Encryption Standard, which is normally regarded as the stronger one. Now, what happens with this, either way, whether I use the WPA Personal or WPA2 Personal, is that it starts with this passphrase, and then the client and the wireless access point are able to, every 3,600 seconds, generate a different key. So initially, if someone saw this screen, they would know what my key is, but 3,600 seconds later on, then this would randomly generate to something else that both the wireless access point and the client agree upon, and then I really wouldn't know what the key would be at that point. Only the systems know that at that point. Now, the enterprise ones, we don't really use these too often in homes because you have to have a radius server in order for these to be able to work, and you just enter in the IP address for your radius server. Oops, I didn't mean to click on that. Anyway, enter in an IP address for that radius server, which then performs the authentication for you. So that means then that all the authentication and that part of the security is offloaded from the wireless access point and onto the radius server to perform all of the authentication. And for this one, again, we also, after you enter in the IP address, you'd also, again, enter in some kind of a shared key of some type that you want, and that's where you would get started. Okay. Again, that key would change after 3,600 seconds, and then we'd have a WPA2 Enterprise Edition, and this one, again, you could use TKIP or AES or just Advanced Encryption Standard, and other than that, it's pretty much the same, just a higher level of encryption. Generally, WPA2 for either personal or enterprise is going to be the better choice to go with. All right, so let's go ahead now and just try to make a connection. I've got a wireless card installed in this computer, so I'm going to click down here by right-clicking, and then I'm going to choose Connect to a Network, where it'll show wireless networks that we see right here. And here's the security-enabled network that I've been working with right here. I don't know what these others are. Some of these are my neighbors. Oh, by the way, this one here, you can see that this one is going to be an ad hoc connection. You see how it has computers that look like they're in a circle there that are connecting with one another. Those are where you're making computer-to-computer connections instead of computer-to-access point connections. Look, someone else here in my neighborhood also apparently has a Linksys router. But anyway, I'm going to connect to this Linksys router. I'm pretty sure that's mine because it's got a pretty strong signal here. I've actually got two of these routers. The other one's here. But this one's one of them. I'm going to go ahead and make a connection, and we'll see how this is done. So I make my connection there, and then I'll enter in my security key or passphrase. What was that? Shaquille. If I'm not sure if I spelled it right, so I'll click Display Characters. Yeah, that looks right. And then I click on Connect. Now, here's another thing that's kind of handy. If you have a USB flash drive with network settings for Linksys, insert it now. Once I'm done making a connection here, I can kind of use it as a template for any other connections I have. Maybe I've got a whole fleet of laptops that I need to make a connection for. Well, I can plug in my USB flash drive, and when I'm done here, I can save all these settings to my USB flash drive, and then go to those laptops, and then it'll automatically, through autoplay, launch the connection wizard here, and enter in all the keys that I need and everything, and that's pretty much it. So don't really have much else to do. I just click on Next, and that's it. I save the network and connect automatically if I'm in range of it, and that's all I've got. So now you can see here that if I go down here to use my mouse pointer to go down here, I do indeed have this Linksys connection, and it will show up here. As a quick side note, by the way, if you do have trouble making a connection, and this is important to know, you do need to know about one event ID that would appear in the event log. It would be in the system event log. Here, I'll just use a whiteboard that I haven't used yet and point that out to you. It will be in the system event log. and it would be system event log ID 6100. So look for ID 6100. That'll be your indication that your wireless connection did not make a successful connection to your access point. Let me also show you something else here, by the way. If you go into this, let me go to view the status of this Linksys connection. And if I go down here to, or up here to wireless properties, notice that there's this checkbox right here, connect even if the network is not broadcasting. If you choose the option that I showed you a little while ago, let me go back to this, where we go to our basic wireless settings and we disable the SSID broadcast, then I will have to choose that option right here, connect even if the network is not broadcasting. If I leave this cleared, it just won't be able to make the connection. It does reduce security in some ways, just a tiny little bit, but overall it's still a good idea to hide the SSID and then select this checkbox. Then returning here to the Network and Sharing Center, once we have a wireless adapter installed, you'll notice now that we have Manage Wireless Networks over here on the left, and as I select that option, we see the connection that I just made a moment ago. If I want to, I can add or remove additional ones manually here. Okay, so that's certainly an option as well. And then if I have a number of different wireless networks that I can connect to, then I also have the option here to change their priorities in this list. And that will be done simply by dragging them up or down in the list. Since I have only one, of course, I can't actually do that. Alright, now one of the exam objectives that you'll see here says remote access. In fact, the exact wording is configure and troubleshoot remote access. Now, this has been the source of some confusion on other exams relating to Windows Vista, and this one as well. In fact, some book publishers who have published books on this 622 and 620 exam is another one that I remember, then they have misinterpreted remote access, at least according to Microsoft. You see, historically, remote access means to dial into a server using a modem, or to VPN in, or to do some other kind of remote access of that nature. However, Microsoft considers remote access to have a different definition under current exams. They're actually talking about remote desktop or remote assistance. You've seen me use remote desktop a number of times. In fact, here is an example of it, where I made a connection to my DC Nugget 2008. I can use the same kind of remote desktop connection to connect to my Windows Vista machines, to my Windows XP computers, even 2000 machines if I want to. The focus of remote desktop is for productivity. This is such that, I might be in my home Windows Vista computer, and I might have forgotten to create a report or something like that while I was at work. So from home, I could, perhaps make a VPN connection into the server, but I could also then use a remote desktop connection to connect to my workstation at work, use whatever application is there to create my report, save it, and really the net effect is the same as if I had sat down locally at that computer and performed all that same work. So it's very, very handy for remote connectivity. Also, the emphasis here is on a single user. I can only have a single user connected to a Vista or XP workstation at a time using remote access. In fact, if there is someone physically logged onto that computer at my workplace, and I make a remote access connection to it, they become disconnected. So you can only have one person connected at a time. And there are probably a few other things we should know about this. First of all, how do we actually configure this? Well, we do this by right-clicking on the computer and going to the System Properties, and then going to the Remote Settings link up here on the upper left. Then we continue on through here, and we can see that by default it says don't allow connections to this computer. And then we can also choose allow connections from computers running any version of remote desktop. And this is, of course, less secure. The big issue with this is that if I choose this as opposed to the third option, then the third option has additional level of security that this one does not. That'll be best described by going to the third option here in just a moment, but also note the message that we see here pointing out that because I've got this computer set up to sleep after a certain period of time, no one can make a connection if it is asleep indeed. Now, if I go to this third option here, this is going to be the more secure option. The thing is, it's only compatible with Windows Vista and Windows Server 2008. That's why when we make a remote desktop connection, I'll just go to my Server 2008 computer as an example. When we make this connection, what happens is we see this little padlock up here. This tells me that it is a secured connection and that the identity of the remote computer was verified by using Kerberos. This is going to help to make sure that I don't accidentally, connect to a computer that's impersonating this server. Maybe someone else, a malicious party, would have impersonated this server, and then they'll trick me into, giving up authentication of some kind, or surrendering secret documents or something like that based upon that impersonation. Well, now that wouldn't happen because Kerberos, that's pretty darn tight and very difficult to impersonate. So this is definitely going to be the best choice if you can. If you run into a scenario where you know that the remote connection is set up properly and other people have been able to successfully connect to this computer using their Vista or 2008 computers, but your XP computers cannot, then we know for sure that this third option has been chosen because XP is not compatible with that. And if we really needed to make XP connections, we'd have to go to this option, which is less secure. Another thing that goes on with this, by the way, if I choose this third option, is that it's going to require fewer network resources initially because it doesn't actually deliver a desktop. What happens is it only delivers the desktop after the user has been successfully authenticated. Whereas with previous versions of remote desktop, it would show you the entire login desktop that you normally see, and that requires more network resources to deliver all of that data. And then finally, another thing you should know is how you can select users. By default, anybody with local administrator access, including the trainer account that I'm currently logged on with, will have access. So that's not too big of an issue. For purposes of our course, I've had to add other users because at times I've shown you other users logged on, but they're not particularly administrators. So if I had to, I could put in any authenticated users or domain users. So domain users, for example. And this would pretty much open it up to anybody to be able to make a remote desktop connection. That's not necessarily advisable in all situations, but certainly it is where you have open systems where you want anyone to be able to make a connection. All right, now let's switch over here to Remote Assistance, which was configured from within the same tab. And with this one, I'll allow people to send invitations to my computer. And let's take a look at what this involves. This is going to be more of a help desk scenario. Maybe I'm a help desk personnel, and I'm trying to explain to a user over the phone how to do something, but they just can't seem to make the connection with me, or maybe I'm not communicating it well, and I really just would like to show them how to do it. But they're clear on the other side of the campus. I don't have to get on a bike or a trolley or a tram or something to get clear over there to show it to them. Or maybe they're even in another city. Well, what I could do with Remote Assistance is I can connect to their desktop much the same way I did using the remote desktop up here, except that they can see what I'm doing. And in fact, I can just guide them through it. They could still have complete control over the keyboard and mouse, or I could request permission to control the keyboard and mouse, and then they could relinquish it to me, but only if they click on yes to grant permission. There is a prompt for that, and this prevents someone from being able to hijack somebody else's computer without their consent, for example. So there are definitely two users involved in this, and it's going to be enabled in a similar fashion as I mentioned a moment ago. If I go to my remote tab here, then I can just allow remote assistance connections to this computer. By clicking on the advanced button, I can say allow this computer to be controlled remotely. I still have to consent to it, and within the remote connection, there will be a prompt for that, as I mentioned earlier. And then there's also an invitation that's involved in this. If I'm a user that's experiencing problems, I can send an invitation to somebody else. And this invitation will be a file or an email, for example, and it can be encrypted so that so that it cannot be cracked apart and credentials, determined out of it and things like this. I can also choose to create invitations that can only be used from computers running Windows Vista or later, which adds additional security measures that previous operating systems are not able to understand. Alright, so I'll just OK out of that and OK out of that, because that's pretty much all the configuration there is there. But another thing you should be aware of is you should also return to the Network and Sharing Center and make sure that the firewall settings are configured for this. Now, I would normally do this in a corporation in a group policy object, and we looked at this in a previous nugget. But here I would go to the change the settings for the firewall. And again, I'd normally do this in a group policy object, but if you want to see how it's done here, you could go to the Exceptions tab, and then I would go down here to remote administration, I would allow that one. Make sure that remote assistance is enabled, remote desktop is enabled. Remote administration is not really quite the same as remote assistance, remote desktop. These are the things I've just now been discussing. Remote administration is kind of another thing that's on a different topic, but that would allow me to, do something like access remote, right-click my computer and choose manage, and then I could choose to connect to another computer. If the other computer has this enabled through the firewall so that it allows those remote management items to take place, then I would be able to do that using remote administration here. So that's what that is. So anyway, I've got all those configured now properly, and I should then be able to allow connections to take place through to this computer. All right, then how would we actually ask someone else for help? Well, if I needed help to work with this computer, for example, then I would simply go to the Help and Support item on the Start menu. Then I'd go here to Windows Remote Assistance, and then I would invite someone I trust to help me, and I would send them an invitation and email, which I don't have email programs set up, so I'll just go ahead and choose this option instead. I'll save it as a file. And this would have to be something where, I could actually save it as a file on my local computer and then email it to somebody as an attachment if I want to, or I could kind of use the email version that you saw as the first option. But in my case, I'm just going to go to a share that is available to us. I have on DC Nugget 2008 an invitations folder. I'll just call this Help. Help, something like that. And then I'll just choose on Save, and that'll pretty much be that. Then you should also give this a password. And that means that this is something that I'll probably agree with over the phone. And I'll say, hey, I'm going to send you an invitation, and the password is, Big Bird, or whatever the password is going to be. And then I just click on Finish. That'll be pretty much be it. And then what would happen is, over on the other side of things, they would open up that invitation, and then they would make the connection to me. Now I'm going to go ahead and just cancel this for the time being, and I'm going to show you the how I, as the helper, would help somebody else from the opposite direction here. Now, to be able to offer remote assistance without that other person asking me for that help, I can do that, but I have to turn on a certain policy, and I've already gone there in advance. But you can see here I'm under Computer Configuration Policies, Administrative Templates, System, and Remote Assistance, where I've gone to Offer Remote Assistance. This means that I, as the help desk person, for example, can offer remote assistance to somebody else without them having asked for it first. Then I'll enable this, and then I can also allow helpers to remotely control the computer or only view the computer. I'm going to leave it at remotely control, but once again, the person on the other end of the connection does have to consent to it. And then for helpers, I can click on Show, and then I can add in whichever user accounts or groups I want to be able to access this. And I'm just using the trainer account for our current purposes. And then once the destination computer refreshes their policy, then they will be able to accept unsolicited offers for remote assistance. Alright, so let's go ahead and see how this whole, invitation and remote assistance thing works. We'll start with the invitations first. Over on another computer outside of your view, someone has had some trouble with WordPad. So they've created an invitation for me, which I'm going to now double click on, and I'm going to enter in the password for it that we agreed upon. And press enter. Now, over on their side of things, they have a dialog box in front of them that we can't see right now, but it says, would you like to allow the trainer to connect to your computer? After connecting, trainer will be able to see whatever is on your desktop. And of course, you'd substitute whatever the name of the helper is where it says the word trainer in what I just read there. And then now the person on the other end of this connection had clicked yes to that prompt, and now I can see what's going on that user's system. If I want to, what I can do here is also set up a chat session. I can send them a help file. Maybe I've got a patch or some kind of an update for them. All these different kinds of things, which somewhat explain themselves. But this is stuff that they connect, or control. For example, I can't click on any of these things. Okay, so none of this was going to help me, and maybe they would send me a log file, for example, or they want to initiate a connection. Or on my side of things, up here, I can use this toolbar, and I can send them a file, and I can browse for it, or I can open up a chat session and start talking to them, and so forth. So that's just some different things that you can work with that. Now, for example, maybe I want to request control. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to, and you can see over here that they see this on their screen. And then I'm going to jump over to that computer and click on yes for this person so that they can allow control to take place. Alright then, so they have now clicked on, allow control here, and now I'm able to go into their interface, and now notice that I now have capability of moving their windows around and doing all of this stuff. And this person apparently is having trouble changing the font size. I don't get it. Life is too hard. Well, This is how you do it, genius. You select the text and you go up here to font size and you make it real big and obvious, okay? So they say, great, thank you very much. You're wonderful. Thank you. I worship the ground you walk on. Great. So now we'll save their document form or whatever, and when we're done, they can disconnect if they want to. They have that option, or I can also disconnect here as well, and that'll pretty much be the end of it. Now, if I want to, I can also continue with a previous item here and reconnect. Maybe if we didn't fully resolve the issue the last time, the invitation is still good. Remember, it's good for about 6 hours. Otherwise, we'll just click on cancel here, and we'll be pretty much done with that. Now, over on the destination computer, I've outside of your vision here, I've run GP update to allow it to apply the policy that I created that allows us to send unsolicited remote assistance. So now I'm going to go back here to Windows Remote Assistance, where we were before, and offer to help someone. Then I'll enter in their computer name, and it's Vista Client 01.nuggetlab.com. I could just enter in the flat name, but I'm kind of used to doing it by fully qualified domain name, so I'll click on next. And then what happens is we're waiting for acceptance. And outside of your view, I'm going to have to switch over to that system here again. And if I can get my keyboard to work, then what we'll see happening here is that they will click on yes. Again, it is something that you can't just wrest control from that person. They have to click on yes to be able to grant you access. Once they've done that, we can see that once again we now have full access to their computer, at least in terms of the view. Once again, however, they would have to go over to, on their system, they would have to consent to the request control item if I wanted to get control from them. Then they would have this message that just like we saw before. And from this point, remote assistance takes place much the same way it did when I showed you just a moment ago. So I'll go ahead and disconnect this for now, and we'll be pretty much done with that. In this nugget, we discussed networking, and this was part 2, where we started off with a discussion of how to configure the network so that you can enter in static addresses for your IP version 4 networks, or you can configure them to automatically receive that information. Then we also talked about IPv6 because it's starting to creep into the topics more and more, although it still doesn't have a big prominence on the 70-622 exam, but you should at least know some of the fundamentals, so we looked at those. I would keep in mind especially that if you have a private range of IPv6 addresses, that they're always going to start with FEC through FEF. Okay, that'll be the beginning of those addresses. And then we discussed DHCP as well. Of course, you can use DHCP to configure IPv6, but for our purposes, we mostly look at it in the IP version 4 realm. And then we also talked about a few miscellaneous topics that just didn't seem to fit anywhere else in my topics, and so I kind of put them at the end of that slide. We also discussed wireless networking. Remember, wireless networking is best configured on personal networks if you use WPA2, especially if it's on a personal network, WPA2 personal, and that you use that with the AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard. That'll give you probably the best security you can get without using a radius server. Also, if you run into any errors, then the system event log will show you errors in the event ID of 6100. Also, we talked about remote access. Remember, it's not really remote access the way we're accustomed to it, VPNs and dial-up accounts and that kind of thing. No, this is really talking about remote assistance as well as remote desktop. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.